delighted and very grateful to the organisers that set up this symposium. It's a funny thing trying to present a book in a session. So I'm not going to do that. We're way behind time. So what I thought I would do is try to talk maybe only for 15 or 20 minutes, and then have a discussion and try to. So the book Ethics in Public Policy, it wasn't a book I exactly set out to write, but what happened was since the late 90s, I've been involved in a number of committees in the UK, all looking at issues of public policy of some sort. The first one that I sat on was probably the most interesting. It was downhill after that. The first one was a review of gambling law in the UK, and this was an official government committee that was set up to look at whether Britain needed to change its laws on things like advertising and gambling and so on, and regulation of casinos. After that, I was asked to look at railway safety, the issues I discussed last night. Since then, I've been involved in committees twice on the regulation of drugs, recreational drugs and cognitive enhancement drugs. I've been involved in projects looking at crime and punishment, environmental sustainability, which I didn't discuss in the book, and a number of other committees. At the moment, I'm on a committee looking at synthetic biology, about nothing, and another committee on the law of homicide, which I also know nothing about. And the way that in the UK, the way the UK differs from other countries I know about, is that we have this idea that there's something called a sort of general expert. You can be an expert without being an expert in anything in particular. Whereas in Australia, when they had a review of gambling law, they got the 10 most published and expert academics to sit around the table and work out what gambling should look like. In the UK, they got 10 people who knew nothing about it, but had supposedly achieved at a high level in some other field. And the idea was that you could very quickly come and assimilate all the information you needed and come to an objective view. And part of the idea of this is if you're already known for a view, then the report is going to just reinforce what you already say. You won't have any credibility. But if you're an intelligent person who can think about the issue and come to an objective position, then you can provide a report that's supposedly objective in some sense. So I've been involved in a number of these things. The only one I've done more than once is a drug related to recreational drugs. How did this all get started? Well, I just got a phone call. You don't apply for these things. And what happened was there was a civil servant who wanted to set up a committee. He had been an undergraduate at Cambridge, and so he phoned his old college tutor to see if this person wanted to be on the committee. He didn't, but he was my boss, and he recommended me. So that's how I ended up doing this. And I got a phone call from the Home Office, and they said, do I want to sit on a committee that's reviewing the law of gambling? And what it would involve is about 10 meetings. And so I wouldn't have to draft anything, because the civil servants would do that. I would just have to go to about 10 meetings, and I'd also have to visit about 10 gambling establishments as well. And would I like to do this? So would I like to go to the casino, the dog track, horse racing, spread betting office, and so on? Well, okay, this sounds like quite good fun. So I signed up to do it. In fact, the civil servants weren't any good at drafting, and we had to do the drafting ourselves. And we had to read a huge amount, a vast amount of material just to understand what the regulations were. Because if you're going to propose changes to the regulation, you better find out what they are. That hadn't occurred to me when I agreed to do it. Because when I agreed to do it, I thought that sounded great fun to do something a bit different, getting bored a bit, and looking for different things to do. But I also, it went right through my head after my phone call that this actually is going to be a relatively straightforward task. It's going to be a relatively straightforward task to reform the law of gambling. Because after all, I'm a political philosopher, and I know the principles. And the main principle comes from John Stuart Mill, which is the only reason for interfering with the liberty of anyone is to prevent harm to other people. So if people want to gamble and they're only harming themselves, then that's their business. We should allow people to gamble as long as they're not harming others. Are they going to harm others? Well, they can harm others if they lose all their money and can't support their family. But that's actually true for anything. If that's your reason for banning gambling, that people can spend all their money on it, you should ban shopping as well. So that type of very indirect harm spreads too far. So do gamblers harm other people? Well, no, they don't. They're not like smokers. They harm other people. They're not like thieves or murderers. So in a liberal paradigm, start with John Stuart Mill's harm principle, and we should have a very, very liberal set of laws about gambling. Now, I hadn't followed that through in my head before the first meeting, but I thought that with philosophical training and having read a lot of moral and political philosophy, it shouldn't be too hard to work out what a set of gambling laws should look like. Now, as soon as I sat down in the first meeting, I realised that it was not going to be as simple as this. Because when you look at the laws we have for gambling, most of them are about protecting people from themselves in some way. That we have, in the UK, I'm sure it's true here, there are limits to where you can put casinos. There are limits to who can run them. There are limits to the types of games that you can have in a casino. So in the UK, if you're playing roulette, the roulette wheel has to have 1 0 on it. If you play roulette in the United States, it has to have 2 zeros on it. No one in the United States can have a roulette wheel with only 1 0 as a way of competing with other people. If there are 2 zeros, the house has a much bigger advantage. If there's only 1 0, the house has a smaller advantage. You're not allowed to change the odds on the game. No casino can say, I've got this new roulette wheel that offers you better odds. That's not allowed. And then thinking about, well, what would it be to have unrestricted, unregulated, or barely regulated gambling? Well, the UK at the time, if you went to a casino, you couldn't buy chips with a credit card. You could use a debit card, but not a credit card. And the idea was, if you use a debit card, then the money, you've already got that money, or you've probably got a small overdraft limit. If you've got a credit card, maybe you can't afford it. So there were rules about how much you could gamble. There were rules about what types of things you could gamble. There were rules in the UK about whether you could drink and gamble at the same time. Now, at that time, in a casino, there was normally a line on the floor between the bar and the gambling hall, and you weren't allowed to take your drink across the line. So you could have a drink, or you could gamble, but you couldn't do both at the same time. You weren't allowed live music in a casino. You couldn't have a band in a British casino. So unlike Las Vegas, where they go to see all the hunting, you couldn't do this in British casino. And all of this was about trying to protect people from their own behaviour. You shouldn't gamble when you're drunk. The rule about live music was that, suppose there's a popular band there, people might go into the casino to see the band, and then they might be tempted to gamble. So you only want people to gamble if they've already made that decision. And the laws we had in the UK at that time were very strange. So bingo, I don't know, do you know the game bingo? Yeah, right, okay. So if you wanted to play bingo, you had to be a member of the bingo club. And it took 48 hours for the bingo club to process your membership then. So now I was living around the corner from bingo hall. This was before I got involved with gambling thing, and some friends came around and thought, wouldn't it be fun to go and play bingo? So we went round and we said we want to go in, and they said, well, you'll have to join. We said, fine, okay, we'll join. And they said, we'll send you your membership card through the post, but you can't come until you've got it. And we were explaining what a terrible business model this was. And they said, no, it's a law. You have to wait 48 hours before you can play bingo. And the idea was you shouldn't do this on an impulse. That you had to have you had to reflect on it before you went to play it. I thought, well, that's taking it too far. You can hardly lose any money playing bingo. You can only lose about 10 or 20 pounds. You could go to the bookmakers and put a £1,000 bet on. But for some reason, the bingo hall had these other regulations. So there are lots of strange regulations. But the general idea of having laws that protected people from themselves was embedded in gambling law. And so I thought, well, do I want to make a case for a type of libertarian situation about gambling? Or should I say, well, for gambling, we should really go with John Stuart Mill's liberty principle? And if we did that, we would have a more liberal regime about gambling than we do about anything else. About drugs, about alcohol, even freedom of speech in the UK. There are limitations on what you can say. So why is gambling so important? We'd have to have a libertarian regime about gambling, but we don't have it about other things. It would just seem to be absurd to argue for Mill's principle here. So I realised that I've been teaching undergraduates the truth of Mill's liberty principle for 15 years, or something at this point. And as soon as I actually had to apply it, I thought, I don't believe it. I think actually it's perfectly legitimate for governments to intervene to stop people harming themselves, in some cases. But, what are those cases? And how do we distinguish them from other cases? So luckily I didn't say out loud at any point, this is going to be easy. And in the first meeting, the chair of the committee who'd done a lot of work said, actually, it looks to me like there are only two principled positions you can have about gambling. One is you allow all forms of gambling. The other is you ban all forms of gambling. And anything else is going to be a compromise between different values. And so we're in the business of compromise here rather than the business of principles. So anyway, I kept quiet for the first meeting. And I went away and thought, what do I do? Because as a moral political philosopher, we put forward these principled positions. Someone else puts forward a different principled position. And you argue. And then what? Well, once you've been doing your arguing, what happens next after you've had these arguments? I realised that in philosophy, nothing happens after you've had these arguments. You just have the arguments. And then you have them again. The same ones again. Maybe with different people. But the idea that someone's going to change their mind on the basis of someone else's argument, this is very rare to see people. They might change their view a little bit, but actually to have this sort of sea change. I thought, well, what is my role then as a philosopher on a committee like this? What am I meant to be doing? Because obviously they invited me on because they think I have some sort of expertise as a philosopher. And what is my expertise? Well, I've read quite a bit of philosophy. That's what I've done. And so I know what's in the books. So if I was to say, if I turned up at this first meeting and said, well, what we should do is follow John Stuart Mill's harm principle. We should allow all gambling unless people can be seen to be directly harming other people. And that's very rare if it happens at all. So suppose I said that, what would they have said? Well, I think they would have said, that's very interesting. But who says that's the right principle? That's what they would say. And so, if you were teaching a first-year student and you gave John Stuart Mill's principle, and they said that's very interesting, but who says Mill is right? What we would say is, no, it's not a matter of who says. It's not a matter of authority. It's a matter of the strength of the arguments for the position. So it's the arguments that matter, not the authority. And you might silence a first-year student by saying that, But the other people on the committee, there was a managing partner of a firm of lawyers, there was someone who was chief of police, and so they're not going to be silent when I say that. What they would have said is, well, that's very interesting, give me the argument then. I think, well, what is the argument for Mill's validity principle? There isn't one, really. Mill doesn't give it. I mean, we can try, I spent a lot of my life sort of constructing various arguments, but they rest on other premises, like utilitarianism and indirect utilitarianism. What does that rest on? And one thing you realise is that we pretend that we have arguments for principles that we offer. But we have arguments from the principles rather than arguments for the principles. And as far as trying to penetrate public debate by using philosophical arguments, you're really in a difficult position. We had the point yesterday that policy isn't a philosophy seminar. Well, this is what I learned, at least on these committees. Because the thing that matters really on the committee is not whether you're right or wrong, because you can't show that you're right. What matters is whether you're fastening onto a view that other people can share from where they are coming from. So instead of thinking in terms of whether things are right or wrong, or whether values are objective or subjective, sometimes people had studied some philosophy, they wanted to talk about whether values were objective or subjective, and they always conclude they're subjective. And of course, in philosophy seminars, we're meant to say, well, that's a philosophical position, we should argue about whether they're objective or subjective, but we don't have time, and actually, I never really have a heart to try to argue for objective values, particularly in these types of situations. So what you need to do is just find out what's widely shared, or what you can say which is based on ideas that other people already have. So you're trying to build a consensus rather than doing something from the ground up there. And so I think you can see that public policy, at least the type of public policy that I've been involved in, which is only committee work, this is the only thing I've done. I'm not an activist, I don't write letters to the newspaper, I've just been doing these type of policy committee work. You realise that there are a number of ways in which it differs from ordinary philosophy. And so one is that you have to replace the idea of the strength of an argument with what you can get other people to agree to, pretty much based on what's already in their heads or in their minds. The main difference, really, something I've already alluded to, is that in a philosophy seminar, you may have 10 people sitting around the table, but the sense in which they're working together is completely different. You've got 10 people who are debating things, but they're under no pressure to come to any agreement. In fact, the opposite. So if you think about a postgraduate seminar that goes over 10 weeks in term, whatever it is, if you all agree in the first week, what are you going to do next week? So as soon as people agree, you forget that. You just look at the bits of disagreement. And so next week will only be about the things you've disagreed about in week one. And then you might find, accidentally, you all agree a bit more than you thought in week two. So you just find bits you disagree about. And this is also what happens in the journals as well. That no one writes a paper saying, actually, I agree with all this stuff. You'd never get it published. So what you have to do is say, my theory is completely different to everyone else's theory. When in fact it's the most minor variation on something we were there before. So Freud has this term, the narcissism of minor difference. So this is, I think, what philosophy is. The narcissism of minor difference. And it's inescapable. Because I was talking to someone else about this, and they said, yeah, I made a similar point. And my first reaction was, yes, but it wasn't exactly the same point. So my version of narcissism and minor difference is not the same as yours. So it's part of our training to look for disagreement, to look to challenge people. And we never have to write a collective report. Collective authorship in philosophy is very rare. So when it's done, it's voluntary. Now, I put a proposal to my department a few years ago that we also have this new type of graduate seminar, where we take people away for 2 days for a workshop, and we put them in groups of 3 and make them write a paper together. And the reaction I had from the rest of my department was as if I created a terrible faux pas. The idea of forcing people to work together to come to a common view is just, we're an individualist subject. Whereas when you're on a committee, you're not. You have to write a joint report. And the interesting thing about it is, it doesn't matter how charismatic you are around the table. You've got to convince the chair, who's going to be, if it's a major report, who's going to be defending that report on the radio. And you're not going to be there to put the arguments, it's going to have to be the chair. So the report has to stand up as a written document that can be defended by anyone. And quite often, I've been involved in working parties for the Nuffield Council, where you're only making a set of recommendations to the council, the Nuffield Council, that has to approve. I mean, the most recent example of this, I was involved in, I wasn't one of the writers, but I was part of what they call the reference group for the British Medical Association. And the topic was, what should doctors do about recreational drugs? It's a good question, I think, because they're the people who see addicts and people who have severe problems and they manage addiction. So, it was a good thing we got a number of chapters written, and we went through a long process. And then when we got to the end of it, we were happy with our report, and the secretary said, okay, we now just have to run it through the committees. What do you mean? Well, we have 100 committees for the British Medical Association, and if the report mentions anything which is relevant to that committee, they have to discuss it. So we've made a recommendation about something that should happen in medical education. So that had to go to the committee. 2 committees, the committees of students and the committees of teachers, just because of one recommendation touched that. And our report had to go to about 50 committees who all had to sign it off before we could then release it. So you're putting forward recommendations, other people have to endorse those, and it goes forward and forward. So you have to make sure that the recommendations are things that people can live by. Also, in the UK, I'm sure it's true here, the media is very important as well. And so, in every committee I sat on, someone has mentioned either the Daily Mail test or the Daily Telegraph test. So the Daily Mail is a right-wing, mid-market, mass circulation newspaper. 5 million people something read it. And they are easily outraged, these 5 million people. And so the Daily Mail will make a scandal out of any story if it can. And the Daily Telegraph does the same thing for slightly wealthier, slightly older, probably ex-military people. So these are 2 very conservative newspapers, and if you do put any liberal recommendation into anything, if you hint that you might want to relax drug laws or something, this will get an outraged newspaper headline, so a campaign against you in some cases for making recommendations. So you have to be sure you're ready to do that. There are other things, so sometimes we have to finish a report in a great hurry because the way the policy cycle works, if we don't get our report published this month, it won't be read in time to influence the bill that's going through Parliament. And if we miss this opportunity, it won't be debated for another 5 years, so we may as well forget it. So you have this incredible external set of deadlines on you. But so, it's obvious when you start thinking about it that there are very many differences between philosophical debate and public policy. So the question in the end was, well, given these differences, do philosophers have anything to add to public debate? I felt I made a contribution to the reports I was involved with. But there was a question about whether that was because I'm the person I am, or because I have a training as a philosopher. So what did my training as a philosopher do? Well, that's a question that's hard to answer, but obviously I think there are skills we can bring. But just to finish on a final note, I think we need to make a distinction between what philosophers can bring and what philosophy can bring. That is, I think philosophical theory is not helpful very often at the immediate policy level. So I'm not saying it's not helpful in a longer term context, but if you've got a report to write, knowing what is in the great works of philosophy or the contemporary great works of philosophy is no help at all. But I do think the skills we acquire as part of our professional training actually are very helpful, because we avoid hasty generalizations, I think was on the slide. That's why I didn't put before, I should have had that. We avoid hasty, we make distinctions, we see what follows, we see what doesn't follow, and so on. There's a fantastic quote, I think I got it from Descartes, but I've never been able to find it again. So I may have dreamt it, so it's far too good for me to have dreamt it. This quote says, the ordinary person not only thinks that everything they think is consistent with everything else they think that everything they think is evidence for everything else they think. And you see this in pub conversations. So if someone is losing the argument, they just change the subject to something they know to be correct and hope that that somehow supports the other thing that they're doing. And this happens on committees as well, that people are often not very good at following through the arguments. They change the subject quickly if they think they're losing. So we can get them back on track, that sort of thing. We learn how to summarize, we learn to see what follows, we learn about logical relations. So we have a repertoire of skills, but I don't think we have a store of knowledge that is going to be relevant. And you might say, well, why then do you need philosophers? Why not just anyone who has training in thinking? And good civil servants, good journalists could do this as well. And to that I say, yes, that's true. That the fact that we've got a set of skills doesn't mean we're the only skills. And this is why many public committees do perfectly well without philosophers. But they have other people who have the same skills as many philosophers. Okay, so I'll happily stop there and take any comments or questions.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much for this excellent presentation.